one of my pet topics that I'm thinking more and more about now is muscle soreness, because I tend to be sore a lot.
Right.
We can talk about that if you want to, but
Yeah.
if someone, for instance, is using a lot of CBD oil to the point where they're having like no pain and they don't seem to be making progress, that's something I might look at. It's like, well, you're blunting. If you're preventing inflammation, you may be preventing the stimulus that you're trying to evoke with the training. Maybe undoing the whole point of the training. Training's fun, and maybe your therapy or what have you, but from a muscle growth standpoint, if you're undoing the biological stimulus of the exercise, then you're going to undo the adaptation at the same point.
Right.
So,
And you and I, we did talk about the soreness thing maybe a month or two ago, and I remember you were saying just try to get sore because I was having some issues with my training, and you said,
oh yeah, right, you
never
okay?
get sore, and you said just do whatever you can to get sore with like the pump days, the fortitude training. Because I'd gone back to that for a little while, and I eventually did with some kind of wacky things, but it is very hard for me to get sore, and I know you're kind of opposite. You seem to get sore most of the time. You said, right?
Every time I mean, almost I could just do one set and I would notice an increase in soreness.
Yeah. And then what were some of those insights you said? I forget exactly what you posted, but you had talked about how maybe you had to reevaluate your thoughts on soreness, on that being necessarily a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I know I can grow when I'm getting sore. I mean, I've been sore in this way like my entire life, and I've made progress. So, I mean, the evidence is kind of there. John Meadows is someone who's more like you. He rarely gets sore.
Yeah.
And obviously he's a huge guy and he puts on size without getting sore. And he would train with higher volume than I would too. And he still wouldn't get sore. So there's a lot of variability here. And I've seen this when I did some soreness research back in the day when I was in grad school.
Okay.
So here's the spiel on this. This is why it's so interesting to me is, many acute studies have looked at muscle protein synthesis. So what's the effect of some particular intervention? So you take essential amino acids, or you take in protein, or you take in essential amino acids with chromium, or you take in some supplement, or whatever it may be, on muscle protein synthesis after resistance exercise. And if you see that particular intervention increases the muscle protein synthetic effect, one presumes that if you did that repeatedly, the increased muscle protein synthesis would accumulate workout after workout, week after week, month after month, and you'd have more muscle growth.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a fair. You see that muscle protein breakdown and synthesis tend to change in tandem, and so synthesis is much easier to measure, and so it's a good surrogate for both of those, and it tends to increase to a larger extent. So that all sort of makes sense. But eventually, in the last like 4 or 5 years now, Stu Phillips is one of the labs that did this. There's a few labs who've made these measurements. They've looked at muscle protein synthesis at the beginning of a weight training program, and then looked at the final muscle growth after like 12 weeks of training, and found no correlation between the muscle protein synthesis at the beginning and what happened at the end. And just maybe a couple of years ago now, as the first name on the study is Damas, D-A-M-A-S. They said, well, what's going when you first start training? We know you get really sore. This is protective effect, a repeated bout effect that comes into play. So maybe there's something else that's involved with the muscle protein synthesis, or just the whole muscle protein turnover, the breakdown and synthesis during that first exercise session, which makes that a really poor surrogate measure for the eventual muscle growth that you'll get. So they measured initially, and then they waited about, I think it was like 3 weeks into like a 12-week training program, and they found that if the 3-week marker, which is past when you have that initial soreness that most people experience, sort of the standard set of responses is you're really sore the first training day, just like anyone who's coming back to the gym, or when you start a new training program, you get really sore. And then you keep on doing that training program, you don't get as sore. I tend to stay sore kind of all the time. It doesn't really go down with me. But most people have a repeated bout effect, a protective effect of previous exercise. So if they're doing the same sets and reps, they're progressively overloading, of course, but the same regimen, eventually there's sort of an adaptation to that. such that muscle soreness is less. So the 3-week mark measurement was highly predictive of muscle growth. It was like a correlation of like 0.8 or something like that, which was really good.
Yeah.
Well, that makes sense. So the idea that the increase in protein synthesis that you see on a day-to-day basis is going to predict muscle growth does still hold. But if you look at when someone's really, really sore, what's going on there, probably the muscle protein synthesis probably involves some protein turnover that's simply a matter of cleaning up all the soreness and injury that's gone on. So if you want, and this is a sort of a simplified way of looking at this, but if you want, we can even tie this back to hormesis in a way. But if you want that muscle protein synthesis to go to an accumulated hypertrophic adaptation over the course of time, you don't want to have that any extra protein synthesis going to unnecessary soreness and injury related remodeling. So I like the term remodeling a lot because it's kind of the idea that the contractile filaments need to be sort of broken down to some degree. I mean, you've got a pretty intricate contractile lattice, and you're adding myofibrils and building those, and they're all interwoven together with Z-line and other connective tissue or connective proteins. So it's a really complex scenario in there. So having some disruption makes sense. So that it's like if you were going to go and like start adding rooms to a mansion, you'd probably have to deconstruct some things in order to make that addition to the mansion functional in some way, shape, or form. You have to knock down a wall if you're going to add another room, et cetera, et cetera. A buddy of mine in college used to say, you got to knock down the house to make it bigger, or something like that.
Yeah.
He was joking, but there's a lot of truth to that. So if you're constantly training so hard that you're sore all the time, and let's suppose that there is some limited resources in terms of turning on muscle protein synthesis, that extra soreness may be robbing those muscle cells of the limited resources for remodeling and increasing the contractile material and making the cells bigger unnecessarily. So maybe it's too much to do it that way.
Okay.
And I've noticed sometimes, and I thought this through on myself, there have been times when I've had actually injuries where I had to cut back. I'd like not train a muscle. Like both my triceps have had some small tears or some little divots that most people wouldn't notice, but you can see them if I point them out.
Okay.
I'm like, okay, I'm not going to train that triceps for a while. I'm going to just do pec flies and isolation delt work with no pressing movements. And when I came back to training the triceps again, it hadn't lost a lot of size, but I had to go really light, and I didn't try to do anything excessive. And I noticed this tremendous growth.
Okay.
Some of that may have been just the different nature of the training that I was doing, but it makes me think, okay, I was trying not to like really whack the shit out of my triceps, which is what I typically try to do. I try to whack the heck out of everything. Maybe I need to do even less. So maybe I'm someone who's on even more so on the low end of the spectrum in terms of the volume that I can recover. And maybe I should try to train so that I'm almost sore never.
Yeah.
As much as I possibly can. So that's sort of my thought. And I've noticed, like actually on this long road trip we talked about before we started recording here, that I wasn't training my arms hardly at all, and I just visually, it looked like my arms were starting to grow, and horrible situation for diet. I mean, I'm driving around all the time. I'm not getting great sleep. I've like X number of different beds, so my low back's bothering me, but I was trying to make sure at least I didn't have arm soreness that was limiting me in my other training, and my arms seem like they may have grown a little bit.
Awesome.
Purely subjective, like, but that's just another thing I've sort of noticed sometimes. I take some time off. That could be glycogen, could be the muscles just filling out, could be a bunch of different things, but there's some logic behind the muscle soreness and protein synthesis and muscle growth idea that I think there's probably something to it. It may explain this responder and non-responder phenomenon, which is another kind of pet topic of mine too.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the difference in volume though and what you experienced, because that is something I wanted to ask you about. And I see this a lot, is probably around 2000, I don't know, 8, 9, 10. I saw a push for lower volume on like the Iron Addict forums and with
right.
I think Skip. his volume and frequency is pretty low. But now we see more and more pushing the higher volume. And I'm sure you mentioned that you're familiar with the Schoenfeld study that was just published showing super high volumes to be optimal. And, when I talk to people who have done fortitude training, and you've seen it too, that people drop down to tier 1 and all of a sudden they're making the best gains ever. And I mean, the volume's fairly low on tier 1. And
Right.
so why do you think there's that discrepancy between our practical experience here and all the studies pretty much favoring higher volume?
Oh gosh, it could be a bunch of things. The thing is, I don't have a lab. I don't have a professorial position right now. So, and it's been a long time. And so I don't know exactly what they're doing with those folks in the lab. First thought before I jump to that one is that just like with anything in the fitness industry, or probably most any industry, or just in sort of human consciousness, is that there's going to be a pendulum, That once everyone's like, oh, like I want to be, let's think about this a little differently, and they start doing lower volume. So people will start gravitating towards that, and you're like, well, wait, there's a fence, and the grass looks greener. Let me go up there. So that may be what's happening with the higher volume, of kind of people, swinging back and forth. And I guess I've been around long enough to see it, go back and forth in different directions.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of biological variability. A lot people there are non-responders that you see in the studies, people who don't grow at all. I've got a whole lecture that I do entitled "Why You Don't Look Like a Pro."
Yeah.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before, I think. And you see like the muscle protein synthetic responses. And actually, I have one of the figures I use in that talk is from that study that came out of Philip's lab. And like some people, like there's nothing, like there's the muscle protein synthetic response didn't move post exercise.
Yeah.
Like how can this be? People will not grow. There's some strength training studies where you've got people making zero gains in muscle strength and people increasing strength by 60, 70, 80% over the same course of time.
Yeah.
So my guess, and this is why it's unfortunate sometimes, and I think in the Schoenfeld study, you do see they used a scattergram, which I was really happy to see, or they actually plotted the individual data points, I believe, for the different volume groups. So you see that scattering that's there, and it's pretty substantial. What I would like to see is people trying to figure out what it is, or how you could tell if someone is going to be more responsive to a high versus a low volume training strategy, or a high frequency versus a low frequency. I have my ideas, and we can go into that if you want on the frequency.
Like ways to predict that they're going to be the one who responds to one method or the other.
Yeah, I mean, not like it wouldn't be a practical in the gym type of thing, but it'd be something. Maybe you could eventually figure that out from making some lab measurements of growth factors.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, if you want to, feel free to.
Yeah, well, so before I go to that, the one topic about the high volume, it was like 45 sets, I think that.
For lower body, 45. For upper body, 30.
Yeah. So, I know the way I train and the way a lot of people I know train, I would have ground myself to a pulp.
Yeah.
In a matter of 2 or 3 weeks of that.
Yeah.
My questions, and I mentioned this, I know you interviewed Steve Hall recently. I mentioned this on his podcast, because we were just sort of talking about it. I wonder, the interesting thing that was a little bit quizzical is that there was not a strength gain above the lower volume group in the other two higher volume groups. So there was more muscle size increases, but this wasn't reflected in increase in strength. So I'm thinking about that group in the highest training volume not getting any stronger. If you read the methods, I think they waited 48 to 72 hours.
Yeah, I think they did that due to abate some of the muscle swelling.
And I wonder, I haven't found any. I looked actually, and I hadn't seen it before, and it would be interesting to see. Like literally, you see the peak amount of swelling about 48 hours after an acute injurious protocol where you're trying to evoke muscle damage. Okay. That's where you have the greatest swelling, is 48 hours afterwards. Now you would expect a protective effect. So those guys wouldn't have been as sore after the period of training or at the end of the period of training as they were at the beginning. But if they were, for instance, reaching the point of overreaching or literally getting, or non-functional overreaching or even getting into overtraining.
Yeah.
And I would imagine I would have been like just dreading going to the gym by the end of that with all that volume.
Right.
Especially trying to train hard. They're not getting stronger. That suggests something. They're getting larger, but they're not getting any stronger than the other group. I don't know where they were in terms of their adaptation curve, but the fact that they weren't getting stronger and they're doing the high amount of volume, I wondered what amount of that cross-sectional area, and they used ultrasound, might have been still due to muscle swelling.
Mm.
If they'd used an MRI, and that's a whole different deal, they could have actually evaluated that.
Right.
Use the T2 contrast shifts,
Yeah.
which basically just tell you about the muscle water that's there, and that gives indication of muscle damage. But they didn't have those data. So I think that people who have gotten used to training for years and years and years, like let's say a decade, of training like their life depends on, like there's a gun to their head, et cetera, wouldn't be able to train that way. So I would have been interested, and this isn't a criticism, but I would have been interested to see how the training went during those training sessions.
Yeah.
I mean, are we talking like blood and guts here? I don't think so.
Each one was supposed to be the failure, which is even more crazy because not too many people are doing every set to failure, but that's what they reported in the study.
Yeah, and I would be, is it just like someone just counting reps and kind of looking at them, or was there some motivation? And those studies have been done. If you're yelling and screaming at someone, you can definitely get more reps out of them.
Sure.
So, and what sort of the dose response of that is, like if you take a group and say, you got your white coat on with your pocket protector and your clipboard and you just count their reps and you don't interact with them at all,
yeah,
maybe you can get away with 40 or 45 sets for the lower body. Whereas you have like some big mean looking meathead who just wants to get after it with them, who they respect, who they like, who they want to work hard for, who's got a great personal relationship and is pushing them on every single rep.
Yeah.
Maybe you can only get away with half of that. If they tried to do those same 45 sets, that may have been an absolute no-go.
Yeah. When I see some of these training studies at universities and it's like a college student, just because, when I was running a training study, 5 years ago now, I was having somebody help me out. And when I had come in, I was a little late and they had started one of the sets already. And they were stopping the sets well before where I would have had them stop the set. And I don't know, that experience made me kind of question a lot of studies when I see them, like how much were they really pushing? How strict were people really being? Just in general, you realize not everything goes as you might expect.
Yeah, there will be some underestimation of what people think they can do. If the more novice they are or the less experienced they are, they will sort of underestimate their capabilities in the gym.
Yeah.
And there's also expectancies that can be brought about. I mean, you can get someone to push hard. If you look at their log, let's say, and you know that they got a set of 9 previously on this particular set, and you simply say, and they've done this before too, okay, you're going to get 14 reps on this one. They'll get like 13. If you tell them, well, we're looking for 10 reps here, they'll get 10 and they'll stop.
Right.
There's some human psychologists involved. So anyway, I think that plays a huge role. And from a practical standpoint, I just can't imagine that many sets being possible, or at least sustainable.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. And that's a shortcoming that's just so hard to get past. Was it 8-week study?
I was going to say, this is for 8 weeks. So who knows over the course of what we're looking at.
I would have loved for them, if they could, to drag those guys back in, give them some time off, and drag them back in like, a week or 2 later and see what happened.
Yeah.
To the muscle size.
Sure.
Yeah. To see if that water went down or see if their strength went way up. Maybe they were starting to overtrain. I don't know if they measured. I'd have to go and look at the study. It's been a while. Someone sent it to me and I was on the road. And so I didn't have a chance to read through in the detail that I had hoped, but I'll look at it. But it would be interesting, like, would they have rebounded? Would they have done what happens so often with fortitude training where they do a deload and they come back? And those guys, like, can you imagine after a week of not training, how awesome they probably would have felt?
Right.
They would have destroyed it. I bet their strength would have gone up. That's my intuition. Yeah.
And maybe
So
then had the superior strength compared to the lower volume groups, you think?
that's what I'm thinking is that strength would have manifested if they had been given a deload. And that maybe, like this is just pure speculation, just trying to make sense of the data. There's, I can guess all I want. It's not going to make the paper any different. They published it. But it may be that the fact that the strength was not going up in concert with the muscle size could reflect the fact that they were doing too much. They were heading down the dark tunnel of overtraining, and a deload could have created could have revealed that they were functionally overreaching.
Mm-hmm.
So they were not making training gains for the last few weeks, but it was a functional overreaching effect, and functional meaning that when they do deload, then they spring forward and they gain strength. And that might not have happened, for instance, with the lower volume group.
Right.
So,
I think some of this ties back into what we were saying before about recovery methods. Obviously, have to be optimal when you're doing such a high volume routine.
right.
I've seen there was a study recently talking about stretching and its applicability towards recovery, but at the same time, very intense stretching like you use can cut into recovery. So I've seen a few papers talking about the hypertrophy response from stretching. Do you still like to incorporate it like you used to? I mean, obviously, I think Dante really popularized it. You do it a little bit differently than he does, but for me, I've noticed it can be pretty intense to the point that I have to back off sometimes if I go too much.
Yeah, well, I auto-regulate it. In fortitude training, I broke it into sort of three types of stretches, as you know. There's basically like the DC extreme stretch, pretty much identical to what Dante put forth. And then an occlusion stretch. So the extreme stretch is a weighted stretch.
Hmm.
And so you would actually be holding a load and contracting against it. Not with the idea of increasing range of motion. I always have to sort of say this as a caveat because there have been people who have done bizarre stuff and hurt themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Like Dante used to tell me, he'd get these messages about like someone who blew out their knees, because they were doing these crazy stretches. So the extreme stretch would be holding a load. It's going to be maybe like 40, 50, 60% of a load you might use for a training set of like 8 to 10. You don't need to like try to do like pec fly stretches with 200 pounds or something like that. Yeah. Some people get a little bit, they throw common sense to the wind with those and want to go too much, and it just becomes like, how strong are my joints? How much can my joints handle before they dislocate? The occlusion stretch basically is you put the muscle into stretch position and then you contract it. Both of those are loading the muscle and they're creating a blood flow restriction stimulus, which we know can increase muscle size. And the other is just a flexibility stretch, and I just think it's a good idea to have stretched the muscle through the active and inactive range of motion. It's just flexibility is a good thing. Within reason, of course. If you're hyper flexible, you can run into issues.
Yeah.
That joint hypermobility. But it's a way that one thing that I noticed this a long time ago when I first started doing it, and I've noticed it. I've taken stretching in and out myself. Is that when you don't do it or when you add it back in, because it does hurt like hell. It's the thing that most people don't do. They just leave it out with fortitude training.
Yeah.
Probably because it's just it's not nearly as fun and it's quite painful and people don't know what the hell you're doing.
Sure.
Like you'll be in this stretch, which is the most painful thing you've done all day long, and someone wants to come up to you and ask you, what you're listening to in your MP3 or whatever.
Right.
But it does create an increase in muscle endurance that I've noticed when it's incorporated back in. And some of that could be just because you've reframed your pain tolerance. So things that were once like really, really painful are not nearly as much compared to the stretches you've been doing. Mm-hmm. But I think some of it probably is an increase in muscle endurance. And that, of course, is going to help with loading, I think. That's a positive thing for producing more muscle growth.
Yeah, I think, and there's definitely, like you said, there's so many different ways to incorporate it. I heard Ben Pekulski report that he said that some of the best gains he ever made was when he had intra-set stretching. So he would do a few reps, stretch, I guess, hold it, and then keep going. I would imagine he would do that like 3 or 4 times within a set. So the work has been relatively pretty light. But he said that he noticed tremendous gains from that. So
that's what Dante's calf standard calf routine was. Do you remember that?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. It was just basically you just do a 5-second concentric and then like 15-second, or do a slowed up 5 seconds down and just hold for like 15 or 20.
Yeah.
It was mostly stretching, just a static stretch.
Yeah.
So
DC, tons of great methods, I think, for pushing plateaus. I would say my calves just, that was like the one thing DC just didn't work for with my calves. And I don't think it's anything about Dante's. I think my calves are just that stubborn. He had that one.
yeah,
And then he had the treadmill one he would talk about where you would lean forward.
right.
That was because you're just 20 minutes of just walking on your tiptoes, leaning forward. That was horrible. But a lot of people, it worked like crazy. So
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's kind of cool because, I mean, I think if I recall, he came with that idea basically just from the empirical observation
like,
that a lot of people who have big calves walk on the balls of their feet
yeah,
and or were obese, so they had to carry a heavy load.
yeah.
So like let's just replicate that loading strategy and voila, muscle
Yeah,
growth.
one comes first. The people tend to walk in their balls of their feet and then get the calves, or their calves are so big that they just kind of bounce. But I have noticed that some people
Yeah.
with calves, just, they do tend to have a little bit of a different step.
They have I forget what those jumper shoes that
Mm.
have a huge pad on the ball of the foot. Like literally, I mean, it's a thick, like probably about a 2-inch pad. So it looks kind of like a wrestling shoe, with good ankle support. They don't want you twisting your ankle.
Mm.
And you don't get any heel strike hardly at all. You just are basically walking on the ball of your foot. And
Okay.
I've seen people get calf growth. There was a guy, I saw this happen. You couldn't miss him because he wanted more calves. He's a soccer player and a basketball player, and he figured he was kind of short and he wanted to be able to dunk the ball.
Yeah.
And I just saw him. He may have been doing other things too, who knows? But I remember seeing him like walking around all the time wearing those things. So that's when I first saw them, and his calves became gigantic. And I've heard of other people doing the same thing, but I don't see people. You look pretty funny. Like you have to sort of basically probably deal with getting asked what's on your feet or getting
Yeah.
stared at all the time. But so people do that, and I think it works.
Yeah. Back in college, I was on the ninth floor, and so I refused the elevator, and I would walk on my tiptoes every single time, up and down, just to try to get something from it.
Did it work? Anything?
Nope. No, they didn't. But
Yeah.
so,
Well, you made the thought you wanted me to go into, and you just made me think of it again there about being kind of a non-responder.
yeah.
Is some of that seems to be dependent upon growth factor response, and the growth factors, IGF-1, mechano growth factor, et cetera, that turn on the satellite cell responsiveness to make muscle. That would sort of require. There's certain situations where you don't need to have an increase in satellite cell number for muscle cells to get bigger initially when they start to grow, perhaps. But for the most part, for a muscle cell to get significantly larger, you need more satellite cells.
Yeah.
This whole idea, you may have even talked about this with someone of a myonuclear domain. So each satellite cell is going to incorporate or provide nuclei that would then sort of govern the protein synthesis and all the operations in a certain volume of the muscle cell. It's a myonuclear domain.
Right.
So the cell gets bigger, you need more of those. And they've looked at responders, everything from non-responders to regular responders to extreme responders. And you see the extreme responders tend to have an increased satellite cell density at the beginning of a training regime, and they also seem to have a more robust growth factor response as well. So my thought, I've always thought this might explain why some people have a good response or good adaptation when they increase training frequency, is that when you train, there's very little data out there. It's just like one animal study that shows after like a damaging muscle bout, a damaging bout of contraction, you get an increase that lasts just about 5 days in terms of growth factors. So if there's some critical growth factor elevation that's required to really sort of set in motion and the whole proliferation and differentiation of these satellite cells, and you're someone who has a really poor growth factor response and is thus a non-responder, if you can couple more workouts on top of one another, kind of like a balloon that gets kind of knocked up just very, very little and starts to come back down again, And before it goes back down again, you have another training session. Before it comes back down again, you have another training session. You may get to that critical level to turn on the satellite cells to complete that whole process. It's not like snap your finger and all of a sudden the nucleus goes from the satellite cell into the myofiber. It's a pretty complex scenario there. So it may be that higher frequency might be more effective for that. And it may be that some people who can do well with high volume, there's something that differentiates their growth factor response relative to the amount of volume that's there. And my thought has been, if you look at most IFBB pros, most of the biggest guys train with a bro split.
Yeah.
They really do, like once every 5-6 days or once a week. And if that growth factor elevation lasts about 5 days, and it's really robust in those extreme responders, then one workout every 5, 6, 7 days really isn't wasting much time for them. Right. Robust growth factor response, increase in satellite cell activity that persists for the majority of that time before their next workout, they're good to go. Whereas, let's say you're someone who gets really, really sore, like me maybe, or has not the greatest growth factor response. You train once, your growth factor response doesn't go all that high. Maybe doesn't reach or get above that threshold for turning on the satellite cell activity for very long. And you've got muscle protein synthesis, which is being used up simply in the repair because you have maybe some excessive inflammatory response at the same time. You've done too much on that particular day. You've got wasted training volume, so to speak, and you don't get any more growth factor response out of it. Instead, cut your training volume back, don't get so sore, and train more often and bump the growth factors up so you have a sustained elevation as much as you can throughout the week. Growth opportunities, as Dante used to call them, I think.
Right. Yeah.
So that's my thought on what might differentiate responders, extreme responders, and non-responders. And I don't know about the volume idea. Yeah. That's a whole different one. I think one thing that people don't think about that often, I believe I do mention this in the book, is that you can also, when you're rotating among programs, and this I mentioned the context actually of DC training, fortitude training, and mountain dog training, is that you can also change strategies not just by changing exercises or changing the frequency or per se or the volume, but going to a frequency change. Mm-hmm. So do a mountain dog training like one of his older ones that is in a higher frequency regime. Do that for a while. Get what you can out of that. When it stops working, go to a high frequency regime. Get what you can out of that and rotate among those. You can actually cycle your volume and frequency in ways that make sense. Do a higher volume, lower frequency, then do higher frequency, lower volume, and back and forth.
Yeah, I think a lot of people want the routine and the answer there, and so it's hard to, you can do both. Because that's kind of what I'm doing now. I did fortitude training for about 3 months. Some of the stretches were beating me up a little bit, and so I went to kind of a more, higher volume but lower intensity. Intensity from like a bodybuilding definition, and feeling better. And then probably in a couple of months I'll go back to fortitude training. But I think a lot of people just want DC is it, fortitude training is it, and it's hard for them to go back and forth.
You might just do that flexibility stretch for you. That's like just 20 seconds of light stretching. If you really feel like the stretches were tearing into you, that could be like a central. I mean, the pain can really beat you down.
Yeah.
And this isn't like a knock, like, oh, the guy can't handle. He's what a wimp. He can't handle pain. If you're really pushing in those can really wipe you out. You get done with a really brutal. Let's say you do a 90-second occlusion stretch and you're just grinding it out for 90. That'll knock you on your butt. You just want to go lie down, and sweat in the corner. So you might really make a stronger attempt to auto-regulate that and say, you know what, I just destroyed myself. All I need to do is some light stretching. I don't need to do an occlusion, or I'm going to do 60 seconds instead of 90, or not even do a weighted stretch. I don't do weighted stretches very often at all. I do occlusion stretches most of the time. Yeah.
I have to look into, because it was something happened where about 6 weeks in, I did a new chest stretch, and it was like by far the most intense stretch I've ever felt on my pecs. And then the next time I did it 3 weeks later, my shoulder was really hurting. And then the next week it was like, or the next time it was like beyond, like, it was just a really problematic pain, not like a muscular pain. So that's like something with my physiology there, my anatomy was just problematic, and I'd probably have to see a PT or something to look into that. So I don't think it's not a knock against forestry training at all. Just something with me, with the shoulders is causing a problem.
Yeah, I'm working on a presentation right now, and I have a section on this in the book too, because people are wondering about. I actually wrote an article that is a lot of the same information called "Rust Proofing the Iron Warrior," and you're getting up there. You know, you've been at this a while, so you have a high training age, especially relative to your biological age. Yeah, and you got to get into this habit, and this is, you know, I think this helps a lot of people in fortitude training with the auto-regulation of exercise selection for muscle rounds in particular. Because you're not locked in to a particular exercise, and that goes also for stretches. So now you learned, like, if you do a pec stretch one time and it feels great, and you come back and like, doesn't feel so good, you'll probably stop. Like, you won't make that mistake again, quote unquote mistake.
All right.
Not a mistake unless you do it, I guess, twice, really. It was just an error that you weren't aware of.
All right.
But now you know. And so, like, I get into, like I was telling someone the other day, like, I mentioned this a million times. It may take me 4 or 5 exercises before I find one I can do some days. So that doesn't feel good. Yeah. I'm like, that doesn't feel good. That doesn't feel good. It's just, I know pretty soon, like a few reps into something, even with like a warm up weight. And I just don't do them. And it's almost always served me. Even if I spend an extra, I mean, how long does it take to like try 3 or 4 exercises? Okay, I'll try the dumbbells aren't working. I go sit down on like a side lateral machine, put a couple plates on there. Okay. That doesn't feel good. Okay, shoot, stretch it out. Nope, still doesn't feel good. Go to the next one. Might take me 10 minutes. Yeah. But I'd rather spend those 10 minutes than be like, well, shit, now I got biceps impingement and I can't do all sorts of things. So that's the thing that it's really, really important to learn how to do, I think. Because this is all, as you've probably heard me say, this is all an unnatural act. These are all bizarre movements. I mean, to try to isolate muscles and lift things up and down repeatedly the way we do, and within constrained planes of motion, and I mean, it's all just a weird thing. We're trying to evoke. We're trying to basically create a giant muscular callus everywhere on our body.
Right.
You know? So we're beating ourselves up, literally. So we have to be careful. So, choosing exercise is absolutely vital for longevity, I think.
So, one thing before we finish up, I had to get your talk on. We've talked a lot in the past about the power of the mind and, how psychology factors into so many different things here. And you wrote, I forget if it was one article or a whole series on the placebo effect.
A couple of them, I think. Yeah, maybe 2 articles that are both kind of converged on that topic.
Yeah. And so I want to see how we talked about these genetic variabilities, and in your experience, how much genetic variability you see in placebo effect. Because, one story of mine that I think is pretty funny. I think I might have told you this with my brother. I don't know if I told you this one.
This rings the bell.
So this was years ago when he had first gotten into lifting. I got him into lifting about 5 or 6 years ago. And I was just kind of messing with him, and he takes my advice pretty seriously. And so I told him that I was going to give him this, like, I didn't say it was like steroids or anything like that, but I kind of joked about it. And I just said, this thing will just make you super strong. Like, it's really direct effect. And it was beta alanine. And the reason I chose beta alanine was because, you can feel it.
Right.
And this was like you and I had just been talking about placebo effect. So he tries it, and like 20 minutes later, he comes to the room, and he's like, Dave, like, I think I'm allergic to this. He's like slapping his face and everything.
Right.
Like, we obviously felt it. We go into the basement where I have like my gym set up, and we load up the bar. We put on the weight he did before. And I mean, he would push himself even really early on his training. He was pushing very hard, and he just hit what he hit the previous time. No increase or placebo effect at all, even though I'd really like conditioned him to believe it. And contrary to that, we see these studies where these guys who are already advanced think that they're taking steroids and get massive improvements there. And that study, I know you know the one I'm talking about, always amazes me because it's just hard for me to imagine like the increases that they saw were pretty dramatic. So I don't know if you have examples that you've seen of really dramatic placebo effects personally.
It's one thing I don't recall you having mentioned before, which I think was super important to the story you just recounted, was he was slapping his face and he said he thought he was having like an allergic effect. So his expectancy was that what his belief was that he was fucked up. Like this is not good. Like I don't like this.
Yeah.
And I mean you don't think, oh, having like, you know, I'm starting to have an anaphylactic reaction. Now I'm going to do great in the gym, right?
I did tell him that was expected. It means it's working. So
right.
I don't know.
But it seems like, I mean, you could maybe ask him this and hard to get his honest opinion, but it seems like that didn't like infuse him with the expectation or the expectancy that he was now supercharged. It sounds like from the way you explained it that he was like, it's like, I don't know if I like this a whole lot. This is weird. I'm having an allergic reaction here. So that's gigantic. That's what that's the whole underlying, as far as I understand, the whole underlying sort of psychological mechanism of the placebo effect is that you actually have an expectancy. You can see what it's supposed to do, and you believe that it's going to have that impact upon you. So if you doubt it, if you're like, God, this makes me feel nauseous, or if you have that belief, if that belief is somehow distorted into thinking, I don't like how this feels, this doesn't work, then you can have the opposite effect. Yeah, you can get an ergolytic effect as well. You know, you could imagine this too. You could tell someone, you could give them caffeine and say, okay, so we're going to test the importance of cardiac output on your aerobic exercise performance here. So we're safely monitoring you, but what you're going to see here is we're going to increase the load on your heart. So you're probably going to notice an increased heart rate, and we're going to reduce your heart's ability to pump efficiently. So your cardiac output's going to go down, and we're expecting that blood flow to your muscles is going to be limited, and this will probably reduce your performance in some way, shape, or form. So they're sitting there going, that kind of makes sense. Like I explained that way, it kind of made sense, right? And I believe it. This guy's wearing his lab coat, and he's got his pocket protector and his clipboard, and you feel your heart rate going up. You're thinking, geez, I'm going to just suck. Like, this stuff's strong.
Yeah.
It's going to get me. It probably would. You know, so that's the thing. But you ask a really good question about the genetics of that. Like, are there genetics to gullibility, so to speak? And the interesting thing here is that the expectancy. I mean, I'm not a psychologist. It would be interesting to talk to like a hypnotherapist if you can find anyone who does this sort of thing, because there's some sports hypnotherapists. We had someone at I had a holistic health club back in Arizona. We had a guy that came in and did a little bit of that stuff. He worked with like golfers and did a lot of visualization exercises. And basically, through the visualization exercise, he was creating an expectancy of how they're going to perform on the golf course.
What was his name? Well known.
Oh, I could look it up for him. I can't remember his name right now, off the top of my head. I tried to find him. I don't think maybe I found him on Facebook years ago on friend request, but I didn't hear back.
Okay.
So he was I'm not sure if he's still in business, but remind me and I'll try to find him again. I'm sure I can. I think I have his paperwork actually right here next to me.
Cool.
But the psychological setting is going to be important here in a certain way. So, like, it was you and your brother. Mm-hmm. Are you older than your brother or younger than your brother?
2 years younger.
Okay.
But lifting a lot longer. So he does see me as a point of authority in this realm, I guess.
Okay. Yeah. So that's the thing. Like, you guys, I mean, even if you were, imagine twins, imagine two scenarios. You've got some twins who grew up in the same, and this is like a confounding factor in the studies of like intelligence. Mm-hmm. Where they're trying to figure out whether to what extent genetics, nature versus nurture, influences intelligence. Right. Is that twins who grow up in the same environment have very, very similar nurturing from their environment. So that's confounding the impact of nature or their genetics on this. So you have a scenario where you've got two twins who are identical, who grew up together, and they see each other as equals. And one of them tells the other, well, this is what this is going to do to you. And they're like, well, okay, well, why should I believe you? You're just my knucklehead brother, you know?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
there's no expectancy that one can create in the other one because they've been doubting each other and tricking each other for their entire life. But they have identical genetics.
Right, right.
That information coming from someone else. So now let's take the genetically identical situation, but a different scenario, hypothetically, where you've got the two twins who are separated at birth. One of them goes to become an astrophysicist. The other one goes to become a brain surgeon. And they meet back up later in life and get to know one another. And the astrophysicist starts telling his twin, same genetics, something about astrophysics that creates an expectancy of what something happening, or vice versa. The brain surgeon says, oh, this is going to have this effect. It's like, oh, well, he's a brilliant brain surgeon. He's been doing this entire life. I'm going to believe him.
Yeah.
So that's like in that scenario, it's just basically controlled for genetics, but made the nurture totally different, and that creates a completely different context for the expectancy that a placebo effect would create.
Right, right.
So now let's take another step, because I love these thought experiments.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So then you might look at a number of, if you could, let's say you've got quadruplets. Somehow two live together and two get split at birth. So you can all do that, but then you've got a number of different twins that you can run through those different scenarios of having grown up together and having grown up separately. And there might be some twins who, when one's a brain surgeon, one's an astrophysicist, that are not very amenable whatsoever to what their twin brother tells them. Despite having a belief in their expertise, they just aren't, they have something about their genetics, let's say. I don't know, I have no idea what that would be, but you could probably find some correlation somewhere. Might make it such that someone's brain just tends to be wired in a way so that they're not as believing of those sorts of things. I mean, it'd be the same kind of question that we look into, is like, what are the genetics of religiosity versus atheism?
Yeah.
You know, like what is the genetics that makes someone, you know, sort of a critical thinker and a disbeliever in the stories that are, you know, this is a whole other topic, but sort of the incredulous stories of, you know, people rising from the dead and blah blah blah, all the things that make up a lot of mainstream religion.
Well, I don't know the mechanism, but I know as far as genetics, I mean, you had told me about Prometheus probably almost 4 years ago now with the genetic data. And one of the things it said for me was that I was less susceptible to the placebo effect.
Oh, okay.
So
what was the gene, and what did it control for, or what was it coding for?
I'd have to go back and look. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but I very distinctly remember it saying less susceptible to placebo effect.
I don't want to make this sound like the wrong way, but I would imagine. Okay, so if someone's evaluating a scenario and looking at whether they should believe what someone says or not, that their ability to evaluate all the other possibilities is going to be reflective of intelligence, I would guess.
Yeah.
Someone like, well, I don't, you know, no, they know of five things that contradict what that person's just told them.
Right, right.
And that's three more things than the average person knows, because that person's very intelligent. That person would probably not be amenable to placebo effect, I'm guessing. So my guess is that, and you're an obviously intelligent guy, is that same gene, yeah, you're welcome, that same gene probably also correlates with or predicts IQ score. There's lots of genes that do that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's my guess, but you know, I don't know. I wish, you know, that would be an interesting thing. Like, gosh, you could, I mean, let's take another step further. If you could figure out what those genes are, you could, or just maybe there's one, like, I doubt it's this case because it's not this simple, but you could literally somehow silence those genes in a way, or if that's what it takes, to make someone more amenable to a placebo effect.
Yeah.
So let's say instead of using anesthetic, you give someone a gene silencer that, you know, only lasts for a few hours, and then you tell them you're going to give them anesthetic, and then they have the anesthetic effect, and then you avoid all the anesthetic risks and that come along with it. That'd be cool, right?
Yeah, I think, I mean, genetics, all that stuff is very fascinating. And kind of the opposite of what you just said. One of my patients today was, by all physiological signs, was completely numb, no response to any like touching, poking, anything like that. But when we started the procedure, every single time he'd say, like, he'd yell and say, "I feel that." And I'm looking at him, I'm like, there's just no way you could feel this. Like, every nerve that innervates these areas are numb. But, you know, he was so, and he was, he had a lot of anxiety, and he knew that.
Yeah.
And I just think, you know, there was just no way he could have really been feeling that, but mentally he said he was. And I mean, maybe he was, but by all signs of, you know, what we test, he should have been numb. So it's very interesting.
You know, it's funny that it reminds me of, I did a lot of electrical stimulation, with people. It was part of my dissertation, and you can test muscle contractile properties, in isolation from voluntary activation just by using transdermal electrical stimulation with just pads on the quad, for instance. And some people just can't handle that. They just don't.
Yeah.
And there were 3 people, that weren't able to handle it in the course of hundreds that I did that with. And one was a woman who tended to faint when she got in new and novel situations. I literally caught her. She started to fall off the testing device. I'm like, she's like, you know, I forgot to tell you. And she went to fall. I caught her. The other guy was, he looked like, I think I told this story recently too on a podcast, but he looked like Hillbilly Jim, the wrestler. Huge dude. He's a power lifter. So he came in because he's interested in muscle strength in some way. And he basically just bolted. I don't have any idea what happened with him. I think he was kind of embarrassed because he looked like the most rugged guy you could ever know.
Yeah.
And the other guy was someone who's now an exercise psychologist whose focus was muscle pain. And he had fought himself into a hole with muscle. I mean, he used to administer these pain questionnaires like, is the pain tingly? Is it hot? Is it stabbing? Is it prickly? Is it cold? He was constantly thinking about muscle pain. He was a wrestler in college.
Yeah.
He was like a really kind of macho guy who was trained with weights, the whole thing, but he had sort of, pardon my French, but sort of mind fucked himself when it comes to muscle pain. So that's what I'm thinking is that person, if they could see that you were touching them, or they could sense, you know, proprioceptively when you would touch them and they would be moved, they were just perceiving that as painful. Just simply because there was some contact being made. And the same thing with this guy who had studied muscle pain, is it wasn't really painful. It was just, he had just an aversion to that scenario where something could be painful, that he was hypersensitive, and his brain just basically created a pain sensation out of it. So, and that's an expectancy.
Yeah.
Like that's the same thing underlying a placebo effect. It's like, this is going to hurt. This is going to hurt a lot, you know, and just like you could probably, I'm just guessing this would be I don't think a human subjects committee would let this one fly too easily, but I think they use like fake needles when they put needles in people, and like in movies and stuff, you know, the needle actually tracks back into the syringe. So like you could say, okay, this is going to hurt, you know, and you go to stab somebody and stick the thing in, and actually nothing goes in them, but it looks awful. Like, oh my God, that hurts so bad. You could probably get people that actually would believe that you stuck the needle right into their arm.
Definitely, yeah. And unfortunately, you've probably seen it throughout your life in different places, but people who have chronic pain, a certain type of chronic pain, if they start to feel even what we would call maybe a 1 or 2 out of 10 pain, if it's something that they've been dealing with for years, it will just set them off. And to them, it feels like, you know, the world is coming down, because it's just, you know, years of feeling that. And like you said, kind of scaring yourself into believing that it's going to be so much worse than maybe it actually is.
Yeah, it's a hypersensitivity essentially. Yeah. I think some of that's, you know, an expectancy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and you can do the opposite too. You can, you know, they've done studies, for instance, with morphine. This is one of the ones, I think I mentioned this in one of the articles that you may have read. And this was maybe I'm just gleaning this from an article I read at some point in time, but they were able to do, I think this was, if I'm recalling correctly, there was some sort of a noxious stimulus like cold water ice bath immersion with your arm.
Yeah.
And I think this is what they did, and you could give morphine, and of course it would reduce the perception of pain. and some of the other physiological parameters they're measuring. And then you could, after they'd done that under the influence of morphine, then you could give them a placebo and it would go away because they were expecting the morphine to reduce the pain.
Right. Yep.
So the flip-flop could work as well. You know,
Sure.
this is something that's painful, and people start, even though they're hypersensitive to the pain, they basically exaggerate the pain in their own mind because they're expecting that pain to happen. Or they can eliminate the pain if you're expecting the pain to be gone. Either way.
Right.
So
I'm sure we could go on and on. We have a ton we could talk about. I want to be respectful of your time. So for a final question, I'll give you an easy one. I like to end on it. Yeah. So people who are listening to this and they are thinking about, being their own bodybuilding coach, what's their next step to go from this interview?
Yeah, that one's pretty easy. I'm glad you said that because I have 2 books. People would, if they listen to the interview, they know. I have the Fortitude training book. That's a training system. And there's some dietary plans or suggestions in there. Covers the mechanisms of muscle growth and training program variables and those sorts of things. That's different than the Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach book. Yep. In that book, I basically give people my thoughts on selecting and rotating training programs and what to consider if they're going to make their own training program. You can get that one at BYOBB Coach or BeYourOwnBodybuildingCoach.com. It's all on my website.
Yep.
But that one is for people who are thinking, the thinking man or thinking woman's bodybuilder, or figure or fitness or physique competitors as well. And so it's, I just want to do this because I refund people's money if they buy the book and it's not what they want.
Yeah.
And I want to limit my secretarial work in doing that.
Right.
Also, get it, please, if you would, from my website if you're going to get the PDF, or go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Some people have been picking it up other places. There are renegade pirate sites out there, and some people are going to hear this and they're going to look for those.
Yeah.
They want to do it. That's okay. But I had someone today, it's just a funny anecdote. I had someone today who came to me asking questions. They actually bought the Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach, and they said, well, where's the training program? I'm like, oh, you bought the wrong book. Let me refund you. And we went round and round, and it turned out they bought the book from one of the pirate sites.
Oh.
So they paid less for the book, but it wasn't what they wanted at all. I'm like, it's karma. I can't do anything for you.
Yeah, really.
Yeah. It was pretty funny. Wow. So, Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach or BYOBB Coach will get you to my site. And there's also a link there. You can find it on Amazon, like worldwide. It's on the German and the UK and basically every Amazon site for every country that I've been able to look it up on. It's there.
Yeah. He's, actually buy the book in the right places because Scott deserves it. He's been putting in a ton for decades, and he's doing really great work. Yeah,
and I will, if you buy it from me, of course, I'll, I help people ask me questions all the time. You know this. I answer questions for free. So,
sure.
This poor guy, I didn't feel too obliged to help him too much more after he knew what he was doing. He admitted to it.
Right.
So, yeah, but I like to help people as much as I can. But if you don't even want to buy the book from me, then I have my hesitations.
Sure.
So,
anywhere to find you?
That's it. Fortitude Training on Instagram. Scott Stevenson on Facebook. And then, as you know, if you buy, I'm just doing this for the Fortitude Training book, which is $20. If you buy that, then you get free membership on my discussion board, and I go there and answer whatever questions are there on a daily basis, and been doing that for like 3 or 4 years now. So
yeah, you're pretty consistent with it.
I try.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you again so much, Scott.
You're welcome, my man. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you guys again for watching the interview with Scott Stevenson and I. Please check out his new ebook, Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach. And if you like the charity that we're donating to today, please feel free to make your own donation as well.